March 10th was the day that COVID-19 was first discovered in Michigan, the state in which I live. Like many others, I was slightly bummed out that this was the case, but I figured that it would just be a minor inconvenience for about a month or so. But boy, was I wrong. As of writing this, it has been nearly 500 days. There have been over 1 million cases and over 21,000 dead. In this time frame, me and many other young people would become incredibly disillusioned with the world we live in and the ethical guidelines that our society follows. Prior to the start of the pandemic, I would have already considered myself a leftist, although I was a much more passive person in this ideology. I believed in things like medical care, education, and housing being provided for free, and that American politicians are insanely right-wing. What did change during this time, however, was my utter disdain for the system that rules over us, and my urgency to want to help make a real change in our society and how it functions. So what happened? When the pandemic first hit my state, I was working in a grocery store that would get very high traffic on normal days. I was paid roughly $10.50 an hour. Better than a lot of people, but still not great. Once the news broke that COVID had finally spread to Michigan, we began being nonstop busy during all hours of the day, with people hoarding anything they could get their hands on. Toilet paper, canned food, meat. It was absolutely insane. Many of my coworkers were forced to stop working during this time due to the influx of thousands of people buying groceries every single day at our store. The people who kept working at the grocery store were eventually forced to pick up more responsibilities and work longer hours. But as it goes, the company refused to pay us more. Despite how stupid this is, it was kind of expected that our company wouldn't budge on giving us better wages. After a couple months of going through this grind of working more hours and receiving the same amount of pay, I began to hear murmurs of something called the HEROES Act, which was a large relief bill aimed at helping first responders and other essential workers. One of the main attractions of the bill was up to $10,000 in hazard pay for those who had to work frontline or essential jobs. Obviously, this part of the bill very much interested me, and I wanted to see it get passed. But ultimately, Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans never allowed a vote to happen on the bill, and the Senate Democrats showed almost no interest in fighting for it. So I kept working for months and months, risking not only my own health, but the health of my family and other loved ones. Every day, I would go into work and be extremely frustrated and just think to myself about how I was being used not only by the company who wouldn't pay me more to help keep them alive, but also by the politicians who seemed very content to just leave me out to dry. The most we would ever get out of either my own company or the people that represent us was a brief thank you for being quote-unquote heroes or quote-unquote essential workers. To me and my fellow co-workers who worked through the entire pandemic, this didn't mean a whole lot. Many of my co-workers got sick and multiple of them were hospitalized, but there was no help to be found. Growing up in America, you would hear these stories all the time. Black man killed by police. I was only 11 years old when George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin, and then was eventually acquitted due to a broken justice system. During the pandemic, there were many similar cases to this one that were eventually brought to light, but the most impactful one was obviously the murder of George Floyd by a demented cop. The entire world watched for over 8 minutes as the police officer placed his knee on the neck of a man begging for him to stop. There were tons of protests as a result of this murder, and it wound up being the largest movement in US history. People were disgusted, tired. They wanted their voices heard and they wanted change to happen. Instead, what we got was media coverage of the protests, painting them as violent criminals who just wanted to burn everything in sight to the ground. They hardly ever showed the people themselves. They never talked to the people on the ground and asked them what they wanted. They just wanted to portray them as villains. And when the cameras turned off, the police smoke bombed them, flashbanged them, beat them, and arrested them. If sites like these came out of countries like China or Cuba, our media would be condemning these as acts of totalitarian communist governments. Yet they remain silent when it happens to the oppressed people of our own country. While the media suppresses the voices of the people, our politicians largely ignore the requests for reform and increase funding for police forces across the country. In April 2020, the unemployment rate of the United States had reached an unheard of 14.8%. While it has mostly improved since then, it is not fully recovered. During this time, people were struggling to get by as the government barely offered to give extra unemployment benefits to our people. Eventually, they gave in, and many people were actually making more money than they were when they worked full-time, a testament to how terrible wages are in the United States. However, many people were still out of jobs, and despite this mass unemployment, people noticed something strange going on. The people who sat at the top were not at all negatively affected by this economic and public health crisis. In fact, they saw monetary gains greater than any other year before it. At the start of 2020, American billionaires held about $3.4 trillion in wealth. It increased to over $4.6 trillion. While many citizens were struggling to put food on the table and didn't know if they were going to be able to pay rent, those who sit at the top were not only comfortable but managed to profit so much that it didn't even make any sense. The system clearly does not work. Many people see that the system is falling apart before our very eyes. Millions of people in debt so they can get an education for a job that will underpay them. Thousands of people going bankrupt so they can get life-saving treatment, or just dying because they can't afford to go see the doctor. Tech companies monopolizing every aspect of our lives, selling our data to force-feed us consumerism. It never stops. Many people like me have been pushed to our limit. We all want to change the system, but what the fuck am I supposed to do?